I've already tested out Pragmata on low-end GPUs and mid-range GPUs, so now let's take a look at the high-end. We'll start with the 9070 XT and the 5070 Ti, which are the more attainable high-end, and then we will look at the 5090 at the end of the video, just because it's a high-end video and I don't really want to do another video on Pragmata here. So the 9070 XT is actually faster than the 5070 Ti in my benchmark run, which includes some of the more corridor-based gameplay, which you just saw, which is higher performant, and then opens out into more open area, which is less performant. But either way, both GPUs do extremely well on the highest preset the game offers. The graphics presets aren't called things like high, medium, low in this game. Quality is the highest preset, and it does include some ray tracing, but the ray tracing is not super heavy. And here we see that the 9070 XT is actually ahead, 130 FPS versus 123, 6% lead. Even the 1% lows on both GPUs are in the 90s, so both really have a good experience here, and it's basically a tie. Now, if we turn ray tracing off, which some people may prefer to do, not really because you need to for performance or VRAM reasons on either of these GPUs, but just because there's some visual noise in the ray tracing, which you may or may not find is worth getting the additional reflections on things. Anyway, so I did test it out. So this is the quality preset, but I've manually disabled the RT. This is still native TAA on both. Now it's 140 FPS on the 9070 XT versus 133 on the 5070 Ti, so it is a 5% lead on the 9070 XT. So again, they're showing about the same relative performance as we saw with RT on. In other words, the ray tracing in this game isn't particularly favoring either GPU vendor between AMD and NVIDIA, at least on the AMD's 9000 series cards, which did have a major increase in ray tracing performance compared to previous AMD generations. But either way, like, you're getting a great experience at 1440p native resolution on both of these GPUs. Now, what we're looking at next is the 5070 Ti on both sides, so if you're like pausing that and emphasizing that. So I'm now switching to just showing the 5070 Ti, and the reason is I want to show you the same GPU with RT on and the same GPU with RT off. Now this is the native TAA at the quality preset, but the quality preset normally has RT on. RT off is a manual choice, which I'm making here, for one thing, to measure the performance difference of using RT versus not, but also so you guys can see a side-by-side of the image quality. Because here's where you can see there's fewer reflections on the right, but if you look at the like floor out in front of us here, there's a bit of visual noise on that. Also, as the character's arm swings back and forth, you can see a little bit of visual noise, which I think is worse on the left-hand side of the screen. And also in the floor grading here, again, it's kind of some distracting visual noise on the left-hand side of the screen, and that's with the ray tracing on. So the ray tracing in this game doesn't, I think, send a lot of rays. It's not super high quality, and I also don't think that it has as good of a denoiser as ray reconstruction when you use the path tracing mode, and you can't use ray reconstruction on the normal ray tracing mode. So long story short, there's some pros and cons to using RT, and it's only an 8% performance difference on this class of hardware. So I think it's really more of a visual preference issue. Now what we're looking at is still the 5070 Ti on both sides, but the left is the ray tracing mode, the right is the path tracing mode. They're both set to native resolution, but the path tracing mode does force you into DLAA rather than using the native TAA, which I am using on the left. Don't worry, we'll look at some upscaling comparisons where it's apples to apples. But the point is, what we can see here is that native res path tracing is not really doable on the 5070 Ti, at least at frame rates that you'd want to play at. Not that you couldn't play at these frame rates, but you can see that as you get out into the more open area, things are dipping below 30 FPS at times. It's pretty close to 30, but again, you don't buy a 5070 Ti to play at 30 FPS, in my opinion. So native resolution path tracing, probably not the way to go here. It's averaging 35 FPS at the end of this run, whereas the RT is almost 4 times as fast at 130 FPS. Now, what we're looking at next is, what if you used DLSS balanced on the path tracing mode up against trying to play at native resolution on the normal ray tracing mode? So that's what we're looking at here. So still not apples to apples, but we're really trying to pull up the realistic path tracing experience up against the realistic ray tracing experience, where ray tracing, you could play at native resolution, path tracing, you have to use upscaling. And I think you guys will notice that the path tracing side does look softer and has a little bit less fine detail. So there is a little bit of blurriness to the image. on the path tracing side. However, there's also less visual noise. It is more stable, and you do get a lot more reflections and better shadows and things like that. So this is another one of those situations where there's pros and cons, but by using balanced mode DLSS on the 5070 Ti, you're now reaching 76 FPS average here. So the ray tracing at native is still much faster, but that's what we were looking at there. Next, I'm actually comparing on the left-hand side, what if you didn't want to use ray tracing if you're not using the path tracing mode? So on the left, we're seeing RT off, native TAA. On the right, we're looking at that path tracing with DLSS balanced. And so here, again, performance-wise, obviously it's a lot faster to even play at native resolution on the left. Now here you can see that by turning the RT off on the left, we're not seeing as much of that visual noise, but you're missing a lot of reflections and things like that you get on the right-hand side of the screen. But again, playing at native resolution on the left, if you look at like the writing going by on that building, on the skyscraper, things like that, like there's certainly more detail on the left. It's a little bit sharper, and there's a little bit more of a blurriness and softness to the balanced upscaling that we're seeing on the right-hand side of the screen. So there are pros and cons to both of these choices, but they're both, I think, viable choices. Okay, now we're switching back to 9070 XT on the left, 5070 Ti on the right. But now we've switched to 4K resolution and RT back on with the quality preset. So this is native TAA. On the maximum preset, including ray tracing. Interestingly, while the 9070 XT was slightly ahead at 1440p, the 5070 Ti is now slightly, but even slightly ahead, if that's a word, on the 4K mode. So the 5070 Ti scales better to 4K slightly relatively to the 9070 XT, but they're still essentially tied, and now they're even closer to tied. So realistically, I would just say they perform the same unless you're talking about the path tracing mode. By the way, in my previous videos, I mentioned that I don't like that this game vendor locks the path tracing mode to just the 5070 Ti. So, just NVIDIA, I guess I should say. So I've already complained about that in previous videos. I still think that's a problem. I think they should at least enable the path tracing mode on other GPU vendors, even if it doesn't run well or they don't want to spend time optimizing it, etc. So I don't like that it is vendor locked. But if you're wondering why didn't I show the 9070 XT using path tracing, you literally can't enable it, which I don't like. It's also an NVIDIA-sponsored game, so anyway. Now, we're looking at 4K DLSS and FSR performance mode here now. And so you can see performance is up, but look, the visual noise is a lot worse. So as the internal rendering resolution drops, so performance mode upscaling to a 4K output is 1080p internal resolution, I think you're also getting fewer rays per pixel, and you're getting more visual noise on the RT mode. So there is, I would say, a pretty big visual penalty to using upscaling when you're using the ray tracing mode in this game. Now, performance is now over 100 FPS average, and even the 1% lows around 80. Both GPUs are still essentially tied, with the 5070 Ti technically slightly ahead. Now, since I noticed the performance mode upscaling didn't look that great with the ray tracing enabled, we're now looking at turning RT off, but still using performance mode upscaling. By the way, this game does support FSR 4, so we are looking at FSR 4 and not like the older FSR 3. So I do like that this game does have FSR 4 support. Anyway, I think visually, now that the RT is off, things aren't as noisy. So if you're going to be using the upscaling aggressively, I would suggest probably having the RT off from a visual noise standpoint. That would be my personal preference. We can see that now both GPUs are still averaging over 100 FPS, but now it's closer to 120. And the 1% lows are in the upper 80s for both. Again, it's basically a tie. Technically, the 5070 Ti 1% ahead in the averages and 2% ahead in the 1% lows. Now, let's go ahead and take a look at this. So this is the 4K attempting to use path tracing on the 5070 Ti. So this is the 5070 Ti on both sides again now. So now we're looking at path tracing, but again, I can't show you the 9070 XT path tracing because the game just doesn't allow you to select it, which is frustrating. Anyway, so RT off, 4K quality preset DLSS performance on the left, and 4K path tracing on DLSS performance on the right. So this is what I meant about we would look at matched upscaling on RT, not RT, but on path tracing versus non-path tracing. So that's what you're seeing on the left-hand side and the right-hand side. Now, the issue here is that the 5070 Ti is a bit weak for path tracing at 4K, even using DLSS performance. On the right, we can see that we're kind of averaging mid-40s in this more open environment. It was a lot more performant in the more closed areas. Some people would probably be okay with this if you're using enough frame gen to kind of smooth it out when you get a little bit low. And then in the more enclosed areas, things would perform better. So 5070 Ti is a little weak for trying the path tracing mode on a 4K display here, but not outside of the usable realm, especially if you wanted to kick on some frame gen to help kind of at least visually smooth things out, even if that's not true performance. Okay, so as promised, I did also check out the 5090. So let's take a look at that. So this is how I actually played a few hours of the game when I was testing out the 5090 initially, and I tried a lot of graphic settings, and this is what I preferred. I preferred the path tracing mode using DLSS quality, not more aggressive than that. And I think it looks really good. And the reason I didn't want to go more aggressive than DLSS quality is because if I want to nitpick the path tracing mode, it does still have some visual noise of its own, especially if you stand still and you're looking at like the white walls in some areas, you'll notice a lot of kind of boiling noise, which I've talked about in a lot of other path tracing and ray tracing games. Sometimes you get kind of just unstable noise. And the lower your internal rendering resolution goes, the more of that boiling noise exists. By keeping it to quality mode, I found that that was greatly reducing the amount of boiling, and the 5090 is powerful enough to still be near 60 FPS in the open environments and well over 60 FPS in the more enclosed ones. And to be honest, when I was actually playing using these settings, I was using ×2 frame gen, and I felt like since even my lowest performing areas were still in the mid-50s, that still felt pretty good as a baseline from which to use frame gen. So these are my recommended ways to play the game on a 5090 on a 4K display. I'll also test out 1440p in a minute. Here we're looking at RT on the left versus path tracing on the right. Now what we're looking at though is native resolution for both. So you might wonder, is the 5090 strong enough for native resolution DLAA path tracing? And the answer is, well, if you're okay with dropping below like 30 FPS in the open areas. So not really the experience you're buying a 5090 for. Now on the left is the just 4K native TAA, and the right is the path tracing DLAA. So obviously the path tracing mode looks better, but it also is around 30 FPS. It's now dropping into the upper 20s in this more open environment at times, whereas the native otherwise maxed out settings without path tracing is well over 100 FPS. So if you want to just play this game without the path tracing mode on the 5090, you don't even need upscaling. Also at 4K, the visual noise in the RT mode isn't as noticeable as it is at lower resolutions. Anyway, now we're looking at an apples to apples comparison, because I know some of you were probably mad that it was TAA versus DLAA. So this is DLSS performance on both sides. So the left is still ray tracing mode, but it's DLSS performance. The right is path tracing mode DLSS performance. Now, DLSS performance at 4K doesn't look bad in the path tracing mode, but like I said, you will see some boiling on certain walls and things like that. Just so a little bit of instability on that. So that's why I would say I preferred keeping a higher internal resolution, but I think some people aren't going to be too bothered by the little bit of boiling, and so some people would prefer to get the higher frame rate. And you're seeing here that even in this open area, I'm now around 80 FPS. So DLSS performance does a lot for the path tracing mode. The RT mode is still twice as fast, though, at 174 FPS versus 93. Now, what we're looking at here is not apples to apples, like resolution-wise. We're looking at, on the right, is the path tracing mode with DLSS performance. So how performant can you get the path tracing mode? And on the left is what if I just wanted to use native rendering resolution. You can see a little bit of noise on the left, but like I said, at 4K, there's less noise in the ray tracing implementation than there is at the lower resolutions, because I think you're just getting more rays cast when you're at the higher resolution. So I think that's why that's helping out. There's still a little bit of noise in the floor grading and certain reflections and things though. So the game does look pretty good at native TAA RT on the left, and you're getting 125 FPS. On the right, we're getting 93 FPS, but we're having to rely on DLSS performance to get there. I do think between the two, though, that I do prefer on the right. So I think with a 5090, I would use some version of path tracing with some level of upscaling for my personal preference. Now we're switching to 1440p. So at 1440p on the quality preset, which is, like I said, the maximum preset, which enables ray tracing, which you see on the left, you could also choose to turn ray tracing off because, like I said, at 1440p, I see the visual noise a little bit more on the left, and turning RT off does reduce that. And like I said, I think it's more noticeable on 1440p than it is at 4K. So that's what you're looking at here. Again, you can look at the floor grading near the character, and you'll see a lot more noise on the left than you see on the right. So that type of thing. Anyway, performance is overall only a 5% difference. So if you're deciding between RT on or off, it's really a visual choice. If you're on a GPU this powerful, you don't really need the performance. Both of them are averaging close to 200 FPS. So yeah, it's really just a personal preference thing, and you can obviously play at native resolution if you want at 1440p on either of these choices. Now, what we're looking at next is ray tracing versus path tracing, both at native resolution. And interestingly, the 5090 is powerful enough to use native DLAA path tracing at 1440p. And you're seeing that versus native TAA on the left with the ray tracing mode. And the performance difference is massive. The path tracing mode only reaching 34% of the performance of the ray tracing, but that is 66 FPS still, which I think is fine to use, especially as a base for frame gen if you're on a high refresh rate display. So if you are using a 5090 on a 1440p display, I would actually suggest try the DLAA mode to get the highest possible internal resolution, and then see if using frame gen on top of that is a way you like playing the game. But you would probably also compare that to using DLSS quality instead, which does get you a lot more performance and just a bit of a trade-off to the resolution, which, like I said, has a bit of an impact to the boiling on the walls and things like that. So that's actually what we're looking at next. And now to get more of an apples-to-apples anti-aliasing, we're using DLSS quality on both sides of the screen here. So it's 1440p DLSS quality on both sides of the screen, but the left is ray tracing, the right is path tracing. Now, performance-wise, now that they're both using DLSS instead of TAA versus DLAA, where DLAA is a lot heavier, what you're seeing now is that the RT mode is twice as fast, 208 FPS versus 109. And I definitely think between the two, the right-hand side looks better. And despite being half the performance is still good enough on the right-hand side for a single-player. Remember, this is a single-player game. 100 FPS is pretty dang good for a single-player game. And so I would, between these two, definitely choose the option on the right. And again, if you're on a super high refresh rate display, you could, if you kick on frame gen from 100 FPS baseline, it usually works really well. So that's the testing that I did on my high-end GPUs in this game. Overall, I'm also enjoying the game. I haven't completely finished it. I know the game is out now, so you guys could let me know in the comment section what you guys think about the game and what you think about your settings. If you're playing it yourself, what are your thoughts versus the RT on versus the RT off? Because like I said, there's pros and cons to both. I'm kind of bothered by visual noise a lot personally, so I'm curious your thoughts on that. Anyway, I hope all of you have an excellent day.